This patch is bonkers. There are so many things going on. Let's get right into it. Starting with a card I think everyone agrees is at least a little bit overtuned. Whether or not they agree with what's happening to him, I think that's up for debate. Pedro Pascal, aka Mr. Fantastic First Steps, is keeping his ability but going to 3-4, which is a larger swing than I think basically anybody anticipated on this guy. They have been making a lot of 2s that accrue value over time, and I think that when you compare Pedro Pascal, Mr. Fantastic First Steps, to a card like Merlin, you can see where one went right and one went wrong. Both of these cards were extremely powerful at 2, but Merlin was limiting in terms of the effects that he could create and the decks that he could go in. He came with associated deck building costs that asked you to put something in order to get a commensurate or maybe even larger reward. Merlin, still a powerful card, unchanged in this patch. Mr. Fantastic, by contrast, was too strong, not just because that his numbers were elite, but also was too strong by virtue of not asking anything of you. If you were playing a deck in Marvel Snap that played cards and cared remotely about the cost and power ratios of those cards, you played Mr. Fantastic. He was a sort of smoother in all sorts of strategies, one of the most popular and powerful cards in the game, in large part because of his generically applicable nature. And they've run into problems with generically applicable 2-drops before, but I personally believe that this guy was on a different level. A lot of those other cards became generically applicable because the thing they were doing was the strongest thing to do, but that's not the same thing as truly generically applicable. Iron Patriot didn't become generically applicable. He made what we consider to be a generic deck better by virtue of building around him. And I think Mr. Fantastic does sort of the opposite of that. You are not committing any deck building resources to this guy beyond maybe a brood some of the time. The rest of the time, he's just doing what he does, and that's good for every single deck. It's actually more similar to Sam Wilson, but even Sam Wilson had more synergistic things show up with him. For example, when the shield cost 1, you would see Sam Wilson with Cull Obsidian, you'd see Sam Wilson with Batroc, you still see that. There were synergies that became regarded as generic of the time, but they weren't generic in the same way that this guy is. This guy is in everything. He does everything. He is extremely, extremely powerful, and he really deserves getting nerfed. Going to 3 cost gives him additional hooks with things like Silver Surfer, which means that he is almost certainly going in whatever Surfer deck exists in that context. He's almost certainly still honestly pretty good at 3-4. I think maybe 3-3 would have killed him. 3-4, we're kind of still looking at him as a very reasonable option, but I do think here he starts to compare worse and worse to his contemporaries because there is just so much more that is asked of you as a 3-drop than there is as a 2-drop. And that is largely where this guy sort of ran afoul of the context of Marvel Snap, where 2-drops aren't allowed to be all that big. We don't really have a lot of 2-4s with upside other than the ones they created last patch. And so you don't have a ton of competition. There's not competition in the way that at a 3, you're competing with Copycat, you're competing with Gladiator, you're competing with Rocket and Groot, you're competing with cards that can actually win lanes some of the time. And so there is not that much being asked of 2s in a way that is not true of 3s, which means that this guy is probably getting worse than you think he is just because of the increased competition at his new cost spot. I think this is a good change, but I would strongly prefer if they just stopped doing these busted 2-cost season pass cards, or really busted 2-cost cards that accrue value over time, if that's what we're really talking about here, because I think that is what we're really talking about here. Which brings us to Surge receiving a much more minor nerf that still leaves her mostly intact in the sense of she's still going to be doing all the same things that she would normally be doing. If anything, the timing on this is a bit confusing to me. I would say I am largely happy with both Mr. Fantastic and Surge getting nerfs. They did a little more to Mr. Fantastic than I would expect. They did exactly what I would have done to Surge, which is just take a point of power off, make it more of a notable difference. She is probably still going to be pretty good, but she's a much more acceptable card to be good than Mr. Fantastic think because she comes with assorted costs. I underestimated those costs when evaluating Mr. Fantastic versus Surge. Mr. Fantastic is a card that I thought would be a 7 or 8 out of 10. That ended up being a 10 or 11 out of 10. Surge was the 8 or 9 on that scale, and now she's going to get downgraded to the 7 or 8, but she is still a very uniquely powerful card that can do powerful things in the context that she exists in. The more that you are willing to play cards that are relatively replaceable with each other, the better off Surge is. And when you look at Surge compared to Mr. Fantastic, one of the biggest things about Surge is that she did not directly encourage you to play tech cards. She was obviously a part of many tech card strategies, but Mr. Fantastic was much, much better for those strategies to a degree that I think people have noticed and picked up on. Surge requires you to play the card that you actually want to play. It's not a coincidence that we're in a sort of juggernaut local maximum right now when that is a Mr. Fantastic card much more than it is a Surge card, and Surge is much less popular than Mr. Fantastic in that exact same context. That's not to say you don't still play a bunch of tech and interactive cards with Surge. They're just worse because they can brick your Surge. And so that's why I think this is a much more reasonable change to Surge compared to Mr. Fantastic, who really did kind of get hammered here. Like, I think he's still an interesting card, and because he says end of turn on him, there is still a future for a guy like that, obviously. But I do think that with what Surge does, it is much more acceptable to have this kind of card at 2 acquiring value as opposed to a Mr. Fantastic card at 2, which asks absolutely nothing of you and comes with effectively no downside other than random output. Speaking of the end of turn deck, Ghost is now becoming a tech card against end of turn cards, which is interesting because I don't actually know if she's a great tech card. I mean, at 3-4, she's pretty obviously not something you want to put in every deck. I don't think she's going to be as relevant to something like Mobius, which is hitting a bunch of stuff and then also a bunch of locations. She's very hyper specific, but what she does is on reveal, remove the abilities from all end of turn cards here. I personally think this card's probably not actually that good, but it is nice that it does exist and it can be an option. Largely the reason I would think this card isn't that good is because a lot of end of turn cards aren't the sit on the board and accrue value end of turn cards, especially with the change to Mr. Fantastic. They're much more like, oh, I'm going to play this late in the game with my Invisible Woman. Things like Thena and Havok aren't really just sitting on the board, but this is a nice little blowout option that can probably do some decent work. I don't know if the stats justify running it a lot, but it is nice that it does actually exist. One thing I would want is for this to be an ongoing ability, although I strongly suspect that that's just not the kind of thing they can do in an OTA because of the way in which previous ongoing abilities have absolutely broken the game. Anytime they do an ongoing ability that has VFX, it just runs the risk of absolutely breaking the game. So I understand probably why they wouldn't do that. That's my guess. I just think that it would be a better card at dealing with what it's meant to be as an ongoing. As an on reveal, I think it's more just like a, hey, just in case some things still end up really too strong, you can still put this in your other style of deck that does some reasonable work if you feel the need to. I don't think it'll be a popular or particularly relevant tech card. This is very much in the vein of Stardust, where like, unless something is a massive, massive, massive problem, it's probably not going in your deck. But this is a deck that has been a massive, massive, massive problem, so it's just nice to have a release valve for it. That is all to say, there's actually another change to end of turn coming too. Havok going to 2-1 and gaining +3 instead of +4. To me, this is actually like the world's most obvious change. I know a lot of people will look at this and say, well, why aren't they nerfing Invisible Woman First Steps? And I can just run you through that one really easily, I think. A card that scales multiplicatively, like Invisible Woman First Steps, is only going to be as good as the things that it can scale. For example, if all of the cards that said end of turn on them gained 1 or 2 power, it would not be worth playing Invisible Woman First Steps. By the same token, a card that gains 4 power per Invisible Woman First Steps proc, right? That card is going to be, by definition, way more valuable. When you compare the payoffs of the deck, Havok does stand alone as the card that is most able to solo lanes. That's incredibly important for how the deck actually functions. It also stands alone as the card that asks the least of you in gameplay. In terms of gameplay, what does Sunspot ask of you? Sunspot asks that you actually skip energy. Athena asks that you restrict the amount of cards you play. Havok asks that you play him on the final turn of the game and let him sit there and gain 16 power. It's pretty straightforward that this is the biggest issue, the largest outstanding nail in the deck. And I think there is a logical argument that maybe they should have hit Invisible Woman first steps instead, but I don't think that actually does what you want it to do. Taking a point of power or two off of Invisible Woman first steps is still going to leave you losing to the 16-point Havok. It's just going to be slightly less power in that lane that the Invisible Woman first steps is in. I genuinely do not think it would matter to how the deck actually plays out in the way that this does. Havok is your solo lane winner. He is a ceiling play. This is the ceiling of the deck being meaningfully reduced. I personally believe that while it would be totally fine to take a point of power off of Invisible Woman first steps, if you are actually trying to solve the problems the deck presents to the metagame, this is probably the easiest way to do it. Deal with the fact that it is currently having the wheels greased by Mr. Fantastic first steps, which is there, and Surge, which is there, and then deal with the biggest outlier in terms of point output per energy, which is absolutely, without question, Havok. Not only is he the biggest outlier in terms of point output with the double Invisible Woman on the board, he is also the one that asks the absolute least of you. This matters a lot, and I think it'll honestly be more impactful than the way in which they changed Ghost to how the deck functions. I don't know if it will be enough to drag it back down to normal levels. I personally wouldn't be shocked to see them take a point of power off Invisible Woman first steps, just because it feels like it'd be a free thing to do. Like, there's no reason not to do it, really, unless it's the kind of thing where it's like, all right, well, this is actually how we generally want the shape to be. We'll deal with the margins later. The thing about Havok, though, is that he's not marginal. Like, he's in all these decks for a reason, and I realize that it's cool that he's good for once, but he's also still going to be good doing this, right? He's still going to be the biggest of these guys who asks you the least in terms of deck building. If I am making an Invisible Woman first steps deck, he is still absolutely in there. He is still one of the best cards in terms of payoff for that deck. I really don't see anything wrong with doing this. And I've been really shocked, honestly, because I saw people speculating about this kind of stuff, that the reception to this I kind of expect to be negative, and I just don't think that's correct. Like, I realize people are largely going to look at it as like, they're nerfing the old card to make way for the new card, but it's like, sometimes you have to change the context around stuff, and I don't think 3-4ing Invisible Woman does nearly as much as what this does to the deck. It might even doing both of those things might not be enough, but like, they're clearly taking steps in sort of unprecedented directions here, and to me, this feels like the most obvious change in the world. This one is really, really, really wild. So basically what's happening here is they're switching Human Torch and Vulture, which I think, zoom out, does make sense. Human Torch being the card that doubles and also being the cheapest of the payoffs doesn't actually make sense when you really get down to it. Vulture being the most expensive of the Torch Vulture Dagger package, but also not having the coolest payoff does seem a little bit weird. So what they've done here is they've made Human Torch the 3/3 that will double, which is interesting because it does sort of imply the potential for less investment in Human Torch. A, no longer dies to Killmonger. That actually is shockingly relevant. Source, I used to hide Invisible Woman under Killmonger to blow up Human Torches. B, it starts at a higher power, and just like how we talked about with Havok, when you have these things that scale multiplicatively, every point of power is incredibly meaningful on them, especially when that power doubles and then doubles again. It becomes exponentially meaningful. I'm not going to sit here and act like this is a buff to the move archetype. I don't know that it is. I suspect it is actually a pretty meaningful nerf. But I also think that it opens up space for them to create a bunch of actually decent support cards that are no longer gated by the fact that they're super stupid broken with Human Torch. One of the most annoying things about this package has been the ability for it to hide so much power in hand while throwing priority. Raising the cost on the card that says double is a very meaningful way of doing that. And frankly, when you zoom out, I think it just makes pure game design sense. for the cheapest of the move payoffs to scale smaller than the more expensive move payoffs. That just seems extremely straightforward to me. The reason this is largely going to be a nerf is I think that both of these cards are worse than their predecessors, right? You can see new Vulture on the screen next to me. And so we have Human Torch and we have Vulture. I think it's pretty clear that they are likely to both be worse than the current existing versions of the cards. And that is, I think, unfortunate. But I do like that they're zooming out here and saying, this is how we think this should be, and this is what we think it will allow us to do. And as an example of that, they talk about how they can now buff other move cards or other cards in the move package without having to worry about, is it too stupid to do this with Human Torch? And I think that's one of the through lines you can see throughout the thought process in this OTA. We talk about these cards as like, oh, the enablers are always the problem. But sometimes the problem is that the payoff is improperly calibrated. In cases like Madam Web, the problem could have been that it wasn't Madam Web's fault at all, just that Torch and Vulture needed to be this the whole time. And when you look at Invisible Woman First Steps, the problem could be something totally unrelated to her stat line, and it could be much more related to Havok gaining +4, or the preponderance of things that when you Invisible Woman First Steps them 4 times, just become a 2-mana Hulk. And I think that kind of thinking is the right way to go about this, although I do think that it does kinda suck to see move nerfed. I'm frankly never gonna be all that upset about a deck with the play patterns that it has getting nerfed. I do think that they do need to take advantage of the opportunity to actually provide this stuff with some support. And I think that if they don't do that, this could be a missed opportunity rather than a good thing. That said, they have offered a couple of tokens of good faith to move players. We have a new Doctor Strange, which is the same Doctor Strange, but with an additional power, which really sort of cements to me that they are willing to do 2/4 as the new 2-drop baseline, or at least consider it on certain cards. After Invisible Woman happened, after this, Invisible Woman, the old Invisible Woman, I should clarify, not First Steps. And so now there is multiple examples of like, oh, it actually is okay to do this. I think a lot of this is understanding that there are associated deck building costs with these cards, and it's not just like you get to free roll them. I think a lot of the original decisions about where to peg power per cost in Marvel Snap were bad, and I think that largely as the game has evolved, they have not really kept up with the times in terms of what it actually takes. And I think a lot of why you see all of these problems with 2-cost cards that accrue value rather than 2 costs that actually have stats is because there's not enough differentiation between a 2-cost that accrues value and a 2-cost that is meant to have stats. When you look at 3s, you could see a 3/4 that accrues value like Fastos, and then you could see a 3/8 that has like Gladiator, right? That's the stats guy for that cost, right? And I think that it is notable that with 2s, that is just not a thing, or has not really been a thing for a while. And I think the fact that they have less numbers they can legally put on a 2 effectively does mean that when they are making them, they very much tend towards making, oh, let's make the text box on this really important, but that's kind of a trap, because the fact that there are less numbers you can put on the 2 means that if you have a really awesome text box, it kind of doesn't matter what the numbers on the card are. And that is largely the thing they've been running into, which is a long way of saying this making of like 2/4s with associated deck building costs, long overdue. This is something that should have happened a long time ago. And I think it's like, I'm glad they're getting around to it now, but like, this probably should have been happening for a while, and it could have saved them a ton of headache if people were indexed to the average 2 as a 2/4 when, say, Iron Patriot came out. The fact that Iron Patriot at a 2/3 had the average stat line and a great text box, that was a lot of its power, right? That's a lot of why stuff like Surge and Mr. Fantastic was good. They were only one step below that, right? That kind of stuff really matters, and I'm glad they're willing to add these points to 2-drops, especially ones that are in the base set. Topaz to 3/5. This is another case of, oh, look, the payoffs got worse, so we can make the enablers stronger Topaz is a very, very strong card at 3/5. Like, legitimately, as long as there is going to be a playable move deck, this is probably going to be a pretty decent part of it. Having those free moves gets even more important when you have the kind of doubling power that the new Human Torch has. So this obviously takes Human Torch to 3/6. One more move is 3/12, suddenly 3/24. If you have a Madam Web in the mid lane, like, you are looking at some legitimate stats in a fairly mid-rangey and still fairly interactive way. I do think that this pushes Move a little bit closer to the mid-range version of Move rather than the bounce version of Move. And I think largely that's a more appealing version of the deck, even though I think it's still reasonable for players to dislike it based on the 50-50 nature of it. I do think that that list, the Hellion type of list of this deck, is legitimately powerful at this point. And when you look at cards like Hellion at 5/8, Topaz at 3/5, or Doctor Strange at 2/4, what you start to see is like a real backbone of good stats that you then have all of this upside potential with when you have these move scalers. I'm not saying it's going to be amazing, but I think that while this is a pretty notable nerf to like the move bounce archetype, this is the kind of thing that could establish the move mid-rangey Heimdall archetype as a legitimate player. Terrax the Tamer is getting an extra point of power, and frankly, I have no idea why. I feel like this is like them playing a prank on me. They always nerf Darkhawk cards. I don't know why they'd be buffing this one. I feel like it's the prelude to them rug pulling me by making Darkhawk a 6 cost or something like that. But this is now so clearly better than Rock Slide, it's not even a conversation worth entertaining. Don't play a Rock Slide, play Terrax instead. By the way, I have heard reports of a bug relating to whether or not these cards appear in your shop. If anyone could give me some pictures and stuff like that, I could try to pass it on to Second Dinner. So if that's something you want me to try to do, I will try to use my voice in that way for y'all. Thank you so much for letting me help you with that, I guess. Any information you can give me would be useful. Things you were doing to like let that happen, anything like that. What I have seen in Team Answers is that they haven't been able to replicate that bug, which is not to say that it doesn't exist, just that like if anyone knows how and why it happened or what they were doing when it happened to them, that's the kind of stuff that would be useful for them to know. And I actually am fairly confident that if you guys know that, I can get it to them. So just wanted to let everyone know about that. There's literally nothing else for me to say about Terrax. The dude is ridiculous. This is just a great Darkhawk card. Are you going to play Darkhawk? Go get Terrax. You're not going to play Darkhawk? Don't worry about it. White Tiger's Tiger got a point of power. Yay! All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. We're going to be testing these out. Tomorrow, we'll have some decks for y'all to play. I'm excited to see what's going on. There's maybe some Marvel Boy builds of Invisible Woman to experiment with now that the Havok output is lower. Maybe we have to be like more of a Kyera deck, a little bit more combo-y. That kind of stuff is pretty interesting to me. Maybe we can still play the same list, just we have less points in it because Juggernaut is that good. It does occur to me that Juggernaut is like still a pretty jacked up card, and they once again didn't nerf Juggernaut, so I will renew my campaign to #nerf Juggernaut. Did you know that at one point in the Marvel canon, Hope Summers fired Juggernaut using Domino's powers like a gun through Thanos' head and into outer space, and no attempt was made to retrieve him? He just kept going forever. That's what they should do to him in this game. As always, thank you for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.